So we're going to talk about chapter 13 and chapter 14 about power and politics. So power is the ability to influence the behavior of others to get what you want, okay? And sometimes it can be a bad thing because if you think about power, it can be positive, where you can motivate people and influence people towards positive aspects of the company, but can also be negative, and people can abuse power. Now, one of the sources of power is quite obvious, is what we call legitimate power. Legitimate power means, you hold a certain role in the organization. For example, you're a manager, you're the boss, okay? And by virtue of the fact that you hold that position as manager, you have legitimate power because that role gives you legitimate power to tell others what to do. And related to that is reward power. And that is related to legitimate power because with that position as boss, you can grant your employees, extra pay, bonuses. So it gives you the reward power as well. So let's take a look at a very famous experiment back in the 1960s. Stanley Milgram, back in the 60s, he conducted a very famous set of experiments about power, social psychology, to see how far research subjects would go following the orders from authority figures. So again, authority figures could be people like your boss at work. It could even be your parents, okay? Police officers, right? So people in authority, right? That's legitimate power. And in this case, in an experiment, the person with a legitimate power is the scientist conducting the experiment, okay? So here we have the participants. One person was called the teacher. Now he's the real subject because everybody else was kind of like acting. So the real subject, he administers electric shocks. And he administers electric shocks to the learner. The learner is an actor. Now, of course, the real subject, the teacher, doesn't know that, but the actor pretends to be in pain from receiving these electric shocks. And then, of course, the scientist conducting the experiment, because he is the guy in charge, he's the authority figure, okay? So, again, this is the 60s, so here's the old black and white pictures, the scientist and the subject, and he's explaining to the subject, okay, now your job is to read questions to the learner in the next room, and every time he gets the question right, continue on. If he gets the answer wrong, well, give him a little shock and then continue the next question. And now before they begin the experiment, the actor is the learner, right? And the subject watches the actor. Remember, he doesn't know he's an actor, being strapped in to receive electric shocks. And the learner says, oh, by the way, I wanted to let you know that I have a mild heart condition. It's not serious, but I just wanted to let you know. And, the subject sees this, and he sees him being strapped in to get shocks, and he's thinking, I'm going to give shocks to a guy with a heart condition? might give him a heart attack and kill him or whatever, So he's really worried about what he's going to do, okay? So the subject sits in front of the machine, and he assumes the role of the teacher to teach the learner, right? Because the experiment is, we're going to see if mild electric shocks will help someone learn. Isn't a stupid experiment, but that's what it was. And the machine appears to give shocks to the learner in the next room, and the voltage label reads mild, starting at 15 volts, all the way up to 450 volts, which is enough to kill somebody, okay? And so here's the machine. You flip the switch, which with each increment of 15 volts, and keep on going 15, 30, and so on, all the way up to 450. And so the experiment begins, and the subject is reading questions to the learner in the other room. And so he does fine at first and answers the questions right. But then he starts getting the questions wrong. So he starts flipping a switch, 15 volts, 30 volts. And at first there's no sound from the other room because it's mild shock. But then when he gets up to about 100 volts, 120, he hears, ouch. And now the subject is getting worried. Oh, I'm causing pain. And he's thinking, what am I going to do? And the scientist who's in the room with the subject, he says, please continue. It's important for this experiment to continue. And so the subject normally listens to the scientist and he flips the next switch. And it gets to the point where 150, 200 votes, the learner starts saying, stop, I can't take the pain anymore. I got to stop the experiment. And the subject is thinking, okay, I better stop here. But the scientist says, please continue. It's important that you continue with this experiment. Now, if you were in that situation, okay, you're the subject and you think you're giving this guy in the next room pain and he's begging you to stop, would you just say, okay, I quit, I stop? See, you're paid to participate in the experiment, but at the beginning you're told you get to keep the money. I think it's $50 or something. You get to keep the money even if you quit the experiment early. So having money reward is not an issue in this point. You get to keep the money whether or not you quit the experiment. So would you quit the experiment and say, no, that's it, man. I'm not going to cause pain to that guy, even though the scientist says, please continue. It's important that you continue with this experiment. So some subjects stopped after hearing cries of pain and pleas of the learner begging them to stop. They said, okay, I'm not going to cause pain anymore. I'm not a masochist. And they told the scientists, I'm walking out. And so they walk out, okay? And they just stopped the experiment. But then there were others who continued to the next level and to the next level, and even to the point of death. Because, the guy is screaming in pain, stop, I can't take the pain anymore. He's going, ow. Right? And then it comes to a point, I think it's a 330 volt level, silence. You flip the switch and out, and no more speaking. And then the subject is thinking, oh my goodness, is he unconscious? Did I kill him? Or what? And the scientist says, please continue. It's important that you continue the experiment. So I'm asking you, would you continue? And what percentage of subjects do you think continued to shock to the highest level of 450 volts, causing death to the learner because you actually think you killed the guy, right? 5%? 25%? 45%? 65%? What do you think? Well, it turns out 65% of the subject continued to shock to the highest level, causing death when pressed to do so by the scientists, despite cries of pain and pleas of the learners to stop. And I thought, that is, no pun intended, but that's a shocking result, that people would listen to an authority figure. So the idea of legitimate power, having a position of authority, even as a scientist conducting an experiment, you've got great power to influence people in positive ways, but also negative ways, like causing harm to others, right? So it's quite interesting as we think about the different types of power that we hold. And then there's chapter 14, which talks about organizational culture. Now, I want to ask you this question. There's different types of culture. Some companies may have, for example, very competitive cultures, when you're competing with each other, for example, to get better and better. And do you think that companies with this competitive culture, where you compete with your coworker for sales, for example, or to get bonuses, do you think that's a better, more successful culture? True or false? Companies are more successful when they have competitive corporate cultures. Well, the answer to that would actually be false, okay? Because a competitive culture can prevent employees from helping each other and seeing others' perspectives, because you're competing with each other. You don't want to help the next guy because you think, if I help him, he's going to get ahead of me, right? Enron, perhaps the most famous ethics case of corporate culture from 30 years ago, created a culture of survival of the fittest. Get this, every year, Enron would fire the bottom 15 to 20% of performers. So they say, you got to compete with each other. And if you end up on the bottom 15, 20%, that's it. You're fired from the company. So an extremely competitive culture where you're competing with your coworker. And the CEO, Jeffrey Skilling of Enron, he said, we have a tough, macho culture. And so these guys, Ken Lay, the founder, and Jeffrey Skilling, both CEOs, chairman and CEO of Enron, create a highly competitive culture which ultimately led to unethical behavior because people would be willing to do anything in order to compete and in order to uh, make more money for Enron. And as a result, Enron at that time it was the seventh largest U.S. corporation. It was bigger than Sony. It was bigger than uh, IBM. And ultimately, if you see that chart there, and they grew from 1984 and around 2000, they grew up, the stock went up to almost $100, but then completely collapsed because of scandal, corporate scandal. It turned out that, there was accounting fraud and all kinds of scandal. And the CEOs were convicted, and Ken Lay, the founder, that because his bad Lay, Enron's Kenny boy, he was sentenced to jail, and actually he died of a heart attack before he went to prison. And Jeffrey Skilling, he went to prison, and recently, just a couple of years ago, got out of prison. So, would you think that that's a good corporate culture? I mean, it worked for a while at Enron, and they did very well, but again, ultimately it led to unethical behavior. On the contrary, we have Starbucks, which has a culture of teamwork. And the idea here is, we're part of a team. We work together for the good of the company, creating a culture of warmth and belonging. We all belong. Everyone is welcome at Starbucks, and it's an inclusive type of culture. The founder, Howard Schultz, said business at its best is not just about making profit. So, Enron was about making profit, but Starbucks says, Howard Schultz said, no, we're not just about making profit. It's about achieving a fragile balance between the fiscal responsibility that we have to our shareholders and our constituencies, as well as our commitment to beneficence and to the people in the communities that we represent. So the idea is, we work together, and we want to contribute to the community. And he says, as a part of a team, we're family. Because he always believed that if you treat people like family, you will make them loyal and encourage them to give their all. When a company cares, it rubs off somehow on its customer, who will gladly return and keep on coming back for Starbucks coffee. So Starbucks is an employee-centered company. Some companies like Walmart, they focus on the customer, right? The customer is always right in Walmart, but not at Starbucks. Starbucks, we take care of the employee first, and then they will take care of the customer. And we treat treat the employee like family. And we are a part of a team. Howard Schultz actually modeled this type of behavior. Back in 1997, two Starbucks employees in Washington, D.C. were killed by some gunmen. Okay, and it says there the discovery of brutal slayings of three Starbucks coffee employees, and they were just clerks, and they were killed. And what did Howard Schultz do when he heard about this? Well, he flew from Seattle, Washington to Washington, D.C., which is basically clear across the country from the West Coast to the East Coast. And when he got to Washington, D.C., where the murders happened, the first thing he didn't talk to the media. He went to visit the families of the victims to express his condolences, to say as the CEO, I'm sorry. Because that's what family members do. They express condolences. And his number one goal was to talk to the families of the victims, not to deal with the media, not to deal with the corporation, but to treat to express his condolences to the family members. So again, it's completely different culture. Starbucks versus Enron, and you can think of some other different cultures that you can look at in the slides and in your textbook. I ask you, as in closing, what kind of company culture would you prefer to work in? A very competitive culture, or more of a teamwork, family-oriented culture? I personally prefer, a more of a teamwork, family-oriented culture.